There are things a country can lose loudly, and things it loses quietly. Britain didn't wake up one day to find something dramatic gone. There was no announcement. No single event. No moment where people stood still and said, "This is different now." Instead, something slipped away slowly, almost politely, while everyone was busy adjusting. And because it happened gradually, most people never noticed it disappearing, they only noticed how heavy life started to feel afterward. Think about how everyday life feels now. Not in the worst moments, but in the normal ones. The constant pressure in the background. The feeling that everything takes more effort than it should. That planning ahead feels risky. That stability feels fragile. That even when things are going fine, they don't feel secure. That feeling didn't used to be there all the time. And yet today, it's treated like the default. Like this is just how life works. What Britain lost wasn't comfort, or luxury, or some perfect past that never existed. It lost balance. It lost breathing room. It lost the sense that effort and patience would slowly lead somewhere solid. There was a time when life could be hard without being exhausting. When you could struggle without feeling trapped. When bad months didn't feel like the start of something worse. People still worried, still worked, still got tired, but they weren't constantly bracing themselves. The strange part is that nothing obvious replaced what was lost. There was no clear trade-off, no moment where people said, "This is worse, but at least we're getting something better." Instead, the loss was masked by progress in other areas. Technology improved, choice increased, convenience expanded. On the surface, life looked fuller, but underneath, the margin that made life manageable was thinning out. People adapted, because that's what people do. They stayed later at work, they spent more on housing, they accepted longer commutes, they shrank their expectations, they told themselves this was temporary, or normal, or just how things are now. And because everyone was adapting at the same time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like adjustment. But adjustment has a cost. When enough small adjustments stack up, they change how life feels at a basic level. Time disappears. Stress becomes constant. Planning turns short-term. Stability becomes conditional. And eventually, people stop asking why things feel harder and start assuming the problem must be them. This video is about what Britain lost without realizing, not to blame the past, and not to romanticize it, but to understand how everyday life quietly changed shape. Because once you understand what was lost, something important happens. The struggle stops feeling like a personal failure, and the question shifts from "why can't I keep up" to "why does life feel like this in the first place?" That question is uncomfortable, but it's also the only place real understanding starts. When people talk about change in Britain, they often point to big moments: elections, crises, new laws, economic shocks. But the change that shaped everyday life the most didn't arrive with headlines. It arrived quietly, through routines, habits, and small compromises people made without thinking too hard about them. That's why it's so hard to describe what was lost. It wasn't taken away overnight. It faded while life kept moving. This video isn't about wishing things were exactly how they used to be. Britain has always had problems, and it always will. There was no golden age where everything worked for everyone. But there was a period when everyday life felt more balanced than it does now, when the basic effort of living didn't take up so much mental space, when people had more room to absorb bad luck without it turning into a crisis. That difference matters, because balance shapes how people think, plan, and live. What makes this hard to talk about is that nothing looks obviously broken. Shops still open, trains still run, people still go to work. On the surface, Britain functions, but beneath that surface, something feels tighter. More fragile, more exhausting. People talk about being busy, stressed, stretched, burned out. Not just during tough times, but all the time. That constant pressure has become so normal that it's rarely questioned. This video is about slowing down and asking a simple question: what changed in everyday life? Not in theory. Not in statistics alone, but in how it actually feels to live here. To work, to rent or own a home, to plan a future, to rest and to feel secure. Because those feelings don't come from nowhere. They're shaped by systems, decisions, and priorities that developed over time. We're going to look at what life used to feel like, not to glorify it, but to establish contrast. Then we'll look at the small shifts that people adjusted to without realizing what they were giving up. We'll talk about housing, work, time, and stability, not as abstract issues, but as everyday experiences. And we'll connect those experiences to the deeper structural changes underneath them. The goal isn't to tell people how to feel. It's to explain why so many people feel the same way at once. Because when millions of people share the same pressure, it isn't coincidence. It's design. And once you understand that, something important happens. The frustration makes sense. The exhaustion has a source. And the idea that life could feel lighter again stops sounding unrealistic. Britain didn't lose something dramatic. It lost something quiet. And quiet losses are often the hardest to see until you stop and really look. There was a time when everyday life in Britain felt balanced in a way that's hard to describe until it's gone. Not easy, not perfect, just balanced enough that effort felt worthwhile and problems felt solvable. People still worked hard, still worried about money, still dealt with stress. But those pressures didn't fill every corner of life. They came and went. They didn't sit permanently in the background, shaping every decision. Work, for many people, had clearer edges. When the day ended, it usually ended. Evenings felt like time you owned, not time you were borrowing between responsibilities. Weekends weren't mainly for recovery. They were for living, for seeing people, for resting without guilt. The idea that you were always behind wasn't built into daily life. You could fall behind sometimes, catch up, and move on. Housing played a huge role in that balance. Homes weren't cheap or effortless, but they felt achievable and stable for more people. Renting didn't carry the same constant fear of sudden upheaval. Owning wasn't something pushed decades into the future. Housing costs didn't dominate every other decision. You could plan around where you lived instead of constantly adjusting your life to afford it. Moving wasn't a permanent state. Staying put was normal. That stability shaped everything else. When you knew where you were going to live next year, you could think further ahead. You could commit to jobs, relationships, communities. You could invest time without worrying it would all be undone by a rent hike or a forced move. Stability wasn't luxury, it was the base that made other parts of life manageable. Time felt different too. Commutes existed, but they weren't designed to consume entire days. Travel felt predictable. You could rely on routines. That reliability created mental space. When you don't have to constantly plan for disruption, your mind relaxes. Life feels lighter not because it's easy, but because it's predictable enough to handle. Money mattered, but it didn't crowd out everything else. Wages weren't perfect, but they moved in a way that roughly matched the cost of living. You didn't feel like you were standing still while everything raced ahead. There was a sense that patience paid off, that sticking with something led somewhere. You could be frustrated without feeling trapped. Communities benefited from that balance. People stayed in places long enough to know each other. Neighbors became familiar faces. Local shops weren't just transactions, they were part of daily life. Schools felt rooted. Services worked with a sense of continuity. That didn't mean everything was friendly or ideal. It meant people belonged somewhere without having to constantly renegotiate their place. Even struggle felt different. Bad periods came with an expectation they would pass. If money was tight, it was tight for a reason and for a time. If work was stressful, there was an end point. That belief mattered. It shaped how people coped. It made effort feel rational. Perhaps most importantly, people felt a quiet confidence in the future. Not certainty, but trust. Trust that things would broadly make sense. That the rules of life weren't constantly shifting. That if you did your part, the system wouldn't suddenly move the ground under your feet. This balance didn't come from kindness or luck. It came from margins. Margins of time, money, stability, and expectation. When life has margins, people can bend without breaking. They can absorb mistakes. They can help each other. They can think long term. When people look back and say life felt easier, they often struggle to explain why. That's because what they're remembering isn't comfort. It's margin. And margin is invisible until it disappears. That's what Britain once had. Not abundance for everyone, but enough balance that everyday life didn't feel like a constant test. Enough room that effort felt meaningful. Enough stability that people didn't live in permanent defense mode. Understanding that isn't nostalgia. It's context. Because once you know what balance felt like, you can start to see exactly how and when it began to slip away. The shift away from balance didn't come with a warning. It came through small changes that felt reasonable on their own and easy to accept in the moment. That's why almost no one questioned them. Each change arrived dressed as common sense, progress, or necessity. And because they came one at a time, people adjusted instead of resisting. Looking back, it's clear that this is how something important was lost without a fight. One of the first changes was time. Work didn't suddenly become overwhelming. It just started stretching. An extra half hour here. A late email there. A bit more responsibility without a clear boundary. People told themselves it was temporary or that it showed commitment. Over time, those small extensions became expectations. Leaving on time started to feel awkward. Being available became normal. Even when people weren't working, they were thinking about work. That mental load crept into evenings and weekends without anyone announcing that rest had been reduced. Housing changed in the same quiet way. Rents went up, but not all at once. House prices climbed, but slowly enough that people recalibrated their idea of what was realistic. A home that once felt expensive became normal. A home that once felt out of reach became something people stopped aiming for. Instead of questioning why housing costs were rising faster than everything else, people adjusted their lives around it. They moved further out. They downsized. They shared longer. Each step felt like a personal compromise rather than a system problem. Commuting expanded alongside housing costs. Living further from work became normal. Long journeys were framed as a trade-off rather than a warning sign. Time lost in transit was accepted as the price of staying afloat. People listened to podcasts, checked emails, tried to make the best of it. The question of whether this was sustainable rarely came up because everyone around them was doing the same thing. Costs rose quietly everywhere else too. Food shops became more expensive, but gradually. Energy bills crept up in steps. Council tax, transport fares, childcare, subscriptions, none of them exploded overnight, but together they narrowed the gap between income and expenses. People stopped saving without making a conscious decision to stop. The margin just disappeared. When life works only when nothing goes wrong, people don't notice until something does. Job security shifted without much discussion. Permanent roles became rarer. Contracts became shorter. Targets became tighter. Flexibility was sold as freedom, but for many it meant uncertainty. People stayed alert, ready to adapt, ready to move, ready to prove themselves again. That constant readiness became exhausting, but it was framed as modern working life, so few people questioned it. Even expectations changed. People delayed milestones they once assumed would happen naturally. Moving out, buying a home, starting a family, taking time off. These delays weren't framed as losses. They were framed as being sensible, realistic, responsible. Over time, people stopped expecting those milestones at all. What once felt postponed began to feel optional, then unrealistic, then irrelevant. What made these changes so effective was that they were framed as individual problems with individual solutions. If you were stressed, you needed better time management. If housing was expensive, you needed to move or earn more. If work felt insecure, you needed to upskill. The idea that these pressures were connected rarely surfaced. People internalized the strain instead of questioning the structure. Technology helped smooth the adjustment. Apps made managing life easier, faster, more efficient. But efficiency often replaced ease. Doing more in less time became the goal, not doing less overall. Life sped up without becoming lighter. People were busy, connected, informed, and tired. Because none of this felt dramatic, it didn't trigger alarm. There were no mass protests about an extra half hour at work or a slightly higher rent. There was just adaptation. People told themselves they were coping, and in the short term, they were. But adaptation has limits. When enough small changes stack up, they don't just alter routines, they alter how life feels. The sense of balance slowly gives way to a sense of pressure. Not panic. Pressure. Constant, low-level, exhausting pressure. By the time people started saying that life felt harder, the changes that caused it were already normal. Questioning them felt strange. Complaining felt weak. Everyone was managing, so you should too. That's how the small changes no one questioned became the foundation of a very different kind of everyday life. Not because people agreed with them, but because they never arrived loudly enough to refuse. And by the time the weight of them was clear, the balance they replaced was already gone. Beneath all the small, everyday adjustments people made, there was a deeper shift taking place, one that didn't depend on individual choices at all. While people were adapting their routines, expectations, and habits, the structure of British life was quietly being redesigned. This wasn't a single decision or a single government. It was a long sequence of priorities that slowly changed who carried risk, who benefited from growth, and who absorbed pressure when things got tighter. One of the biggest shifts was how housing was treated. Homes gradually stopped being seen mainly as places to live and became assets to hold value. That change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always framed as a problem. Rising house prices were celebrated as signs of success and stability. Ownership became a marker of security, but only for those who already had it. For everyone else, housing turned into a source of uncertainty. Renters carried rising costs without gaining stability. Buyers took on larger debts for longer periods. The system began rewarding scarcity instead of solving it. At the same time, building slowed relative to need. Planning became more restrictive. Development became more complex. Supply failed to keep up with population growth and demand. Instead of fixing the gap, the system learned to live with it. Higher prices became normal. Longer waits became expected. Housing stopped adjusting to people's lives, and people were forced to adjust their lives around housing. That wasn't a cultural shift, it was a structural one. Work changed in a similar way. Stable, long-term employment became less common, replaced by performance metrics, short contracts, outsourcing, and constant evaluation. Flexibility was presented as modern and empowering, but much of that flexibility flowed upward. Employers gained the ability to scale labor quickly. Workers absorbed the uncertainty. When work is unstable, people become cautious. They save less, move less, plan less. The structure encourages compliance, not confidence. Wages quietly disconnected from the real cost of living. On paper, pay rose slowly. In reality, it lagged behind housing, transport, childcare, and energy costs. For a long time, low interest rates masked the problem. Cheap borrowing filled the gap. People stretched further. Debt replaced wage growth. Life continued, but on thinner margins. When conditions changed, the gap became impossible to ignore. The role of the state shifted too. Support systems became more conditional, more complex, and more fragmented. Responsibility moved away from collective solutions and toward individual management. If life felt hard, the answer increasingly focused on personal adjustment rather than structural repair. Policy language emphasized resilience, flexibility, and adaptation, useful traits, but also a way to normalize pressure. What made this structural shift so powerful was how invisible it felt in daily life. People experienced its effects, stress, instability, exhaustion, without seeing its shape. Because the pressure showed up as personal problems, it felt personal. People blamed themselves for struggling instead of recognizing that the ground beneath them had shifted. Over time, risk moved downward. Households became shock absorbers for economic change. Rising costs, unstable work, and housing shortages didn't break systems immediately, they stretched people instead. That stretching became the default response to crisis. The system survived because individuals bent. This shift changed how life feels at a basic level. When risk sits with individuals rather than institutions, uncertainty becomes constant. Decisions feel heavier. Commitment feels dangerous. People stay alert, not relaxed. That state might be manageable for a while, but over years it drains energy, trust, and ambition. The most important thing to understand is that none of this was inevitable. It wasn't the natural result of modern life. It was the outcome of choices about housing, labor, investment, and responsibility made gradually and often without clear public debate. Because the effects arrived slowly, they were easier to live with than to challenge. But once the structure changes, everyday life follows. The small adjustments people made weren't random. They were responses to a system that no longer offered balance as a default. When stability becomes something you have to earn and constantly defend, life stops feeling manageable even when everything looks like it's still working. That's the shift underneath, and it explains why so many people feel the same pressure at once, even though their lives look different on the surface. What was lost because of this shift isn't always easy to name, because it wasn't a single thing you could point to and say, that's gone. It was a collection of everyday supports that quietly held life together, things people relied on without thinking about them. Once they faded, life didn't collapse, it tightened. And that tightening changed how people lived, thought, and related to each other. One of the biggest losses was stability. Not total security, but the ability to stay put without constant anxiety. People used to expect that if they were doing reasonably well, they could remain in the same home, the same job, the same area for a meaningful stretch of time. That expectation shaped behavior. It allowed people to commit, to put down roots, to invest emotionally in where they lived. As housing became less secure and work more uncertain, that sense of continuity weakened. Moving became more common. Temporary arrangements became normal. Life started to feel provisional, as if everything was subject to change at any moment. Time was another major loss. Not just free time, but unpressured time. Time that wasn't already allocated to catching up, managing admin, or preparing for the next week. Evenings used to feel like space. Weekends used to feel restorative. As work spilled beyond its old boundaries and commutes grew longer, time became fragmented. Rest stopped being automatic and started requiring effort. When rest becomes something you have to schedule, it often disappears. Along with time went mental space. The constant need to plan, adjust, and anticipate problems created a low-level stress that never fully switched off. People began carrying life in their heads at all times: bills, deadlines, rent reviews, job security, travel plans. Even when nothing was actively wrong, there was a sense of waiting for the next issue. That mental load changes how people experience life. Joy becomes harder to access. Calm becomes rare. Community was quietly eroded as well. When people move more often, work longer hours, and feel constantly stretched, social ties weaken. Neighbors become strangers. Local shops become transactions rather than relationships. Informal support networks thin out. People still live near each other, but they don't always feel connected. Loneliness grows not because people are antisocial, but because life leaves less room for connection. Another loss was confidence in the future. Not optimism in a vague sense, but practical confidence. The belief that planning ahead made sense. That effort now would pay off later. As costs rose faster than wages and stability declined, that belief weakened. People delayed decisions. They hedged. They kept options open. Life became short-term not because people lacked ambition, but because long-term commitments felt risky. Perhaps most damaging was the loss of fairness as a felt experience. Even when life was hard before, many people believed the system broadly made sense. That effort and responsibility were roughly matched by reward and stability. As the structural shift took hold, that connection weakened. People worked harder without feeling more secure. They followed the rules without seeing the benefits. Over time, that breeds quiet frustration and disengagement. What makes these losses so powerful is that they reinforce each other. Less stability makes planning harder. Less time makes connection harder. Less connection makes stress feel heavier. Less confidence makes people cautious. Life shrinks not because people want less, but because the environment encourages retreat. None of this shows up clearly in statistics. GDP can grow while balance disappears. Employment can remain high while exhaustion spreads. Systems can function while people struggle. That's why this loss went largely unnoticed at first. It didn't look like failure. It looked like adaptation. But when you add it all together, what was lost was something fundamental, the sense that everyday life was working with you instead of testing you. That feeling doesn't come from comfort or wealth alone. It comes from margin, trust, and stability. Britain didn't lose its ability to function. It lost the conditions that made functioning feel sustainable. And that loss is felt not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet heaviness that has become normal for so many people. Understanding what was lost isn't about looking backwards. It's about recognizing what matters when we talk about a life that feels manageable, and why its absence is felt so deeply today. The reason this loss still matters is simple. When balance disappears from everyday life, the effects don't stay contained to one generation, one income group, or one moment in time. They spread. They compound, and over time, they reshape how an entire country behaves, thinks, and plans for the future. What Britain lost wasn't just a nicer way of living, it was a foundation that quietly supported resilience, ambition, and trust. When life feels permanently tight, people stop taking risks. Not reckless risks, but healthy ones. Starting a business, changing careers, moving to a new place, having children, investing time in long-term projects. These choices depend on a belief that the future is at least somewhat predictable. When housing is unstable, work feels insecure, and costs rise faster than pay, that belief weakens. People become cautious by necessity. Over time, caution becomes the norm. A society built on caution doesn't collapse, but it does slow down. Creativity drops. Initiative fades. People protect what little stability they have instead of reaching for more. This loss also matters because it changes how people relate to institutions. When everyday life feels harder year after year, trust erodes. People stop believing systems are designed for them. They disengage quietly. They still vote, still work, still comply, but without confidence. That kind of disengagement is subtle but dangerous. It creates distance between people and the structures meant to support them. Once that distance forms, repairing it becomes far harder than preventing it in the first place. The loss of balance also feeds inequality in ways that aren't always visible. Those with assets, family support, or secure jobs can absorb pressure more easily. Those without carry the full weight. Over time, the gap isn't just about income, it's about experience. Some people live with margin, others live with constant stress. That divide shapes health, education outcomes, opportunity, and even how long people live. A country can tolerate inequality on paper for a long time, but lived inequality corrodes social cohesion. Mental health is another area where this loss matters deeply. Constant low-level stress doesn't always look dramatic, but it wears people down. When rest becomes rare and uncertainty becomes constant, anxiety and burnout spread. People blame themselves for not coping better, unaware that the environment itself has changed. That self-blame isolates people further and makes collective solutions harder to imagine. This loss also affects how Britain handles crises. A society already stretched thin has less capacity to respond when something goes wrong. Whether it's a recession, a health emergency, or extreme weather, resilience depends on margin. When households, services, and workers are already operating at their limit, shocks hit harder and recovery takes longer. The past winters that nearly broke Britain taught this lesson clearly. Balance isn't comfort, it's preparedness. Perhaps most importantly, this loss matters because it shapes expectations. When struggle becomes normal, people lower the bar for what they think is reasonable. They stop demanding better conditions and start asking how to cope. Over time, that shift becomes cultural. It affects what policies are considered possible, what solutions feel realistic, and what futures people allow themselves to imagine. Britain didn't lose balance overnight, and it won't regain it overnight either. But recognizing the loss is the first step. Not to romanticize the past, but to understand that everyday life doesn't have to feel this heavy. That pressure isn't a law of nature. It's the result of choices, priorities, and structures that can be questioned and changed. This loss still matters because it's still shaping lives right now. It influences how people wake up, go to work, make decisions, and think about tomorrow. And until it's acknowledged, the quiet struggle that defines modern life will continue to be treated as normal, even though it doesn't have to be. If this stays normal, Britain doesn't suddenly collapse. There's no dramatic breaking point, no single day where everything falls apart. Instead, the country slides into something quieter and more dangerous, a permanent state of strain. Life keeps moving, but with less energy, less confidence, and less belief that things can improve. People still work, still pay bills, still show up, but they do it while constantly bracing themselves, as if the ground could shift at any moment. When pressure becomes permanent, people adapt in ways that slowly change the country's character. They stop planning far ahead, big decisions get delayed or avoided altogether. Not because people don't want more from life, but because committing feels risky. Stability becomes something to defend, not something to build on. Over time, ambition narrows. People aim for survival instead of progress. That doesn't look like failure on the surface, but it quietly limits what a society can become. Work starts to feel transactional rather than meaningful. When effort no longer leads to security, people give only what they have to. They protect their energy. Innovation slows. Productivity becomes harder to sustain, not because people are lazy, but because they're tired. A country can function like that for a while, but it loses momentum. Growth becomes shallow. Progress becomes harder to feel. Communities thin out further. When people move often, work long hours, and feel constantly stretched, connection becomes optional instead of natural. Loneliness grows quietly. Trust weakens. Shared life shrinks. Britain doesn't stop being social, but it becomes less cohesive. People live near each other without really living together. Inequality hardens in this future. Those with assets, family support, or secure jobs remain insulated. Everyone else absorbs more pressure year after year. The divide stops being just about money and becomes about how safe life feels. Some people live with margin. Others live one shock away from crisis. That kind of divide shapes health, opportunity, and even how long people live. And once it settles in, it becomes self-reinforcing. Perhaps the most dangerous outcome is normalization. When struggle lasts long enough, it stops feeling temporary. People stop asking why life feels so heavy and start assuming that's just how it is. Expectations lower. Anger fades into resignation. That's the moment real change becomes hardest, because belief in something better has been worn down. This is the quiet future Britain is sliding toward if nothing changes. Not chaos, not collapse, just a country that still works, but feels tighter, smaller, more exhausting than it needs to be. A place where people cope instead of thrive, endure instead of build, adjust instead of demand better. But understanding this matters, because this future isn't inevitable. What Britain lost wasn't luck or character. It was balance, and balance is something societies can choose to rebuild. Recognizing the loss is the first step. Naming it matters, Because once people see that the pressure they feel isn't personal failure but shared experience, the story changes. Britain has lived many different versions of everyday life before. The one we're drifting into now is just one possible outcome, not the only one. For more about Britain tomorrow, subscribe and watch the next video.